In today's America, it would be hard to know who is least familiar to the most people, Abraham Lincoln or Abraham the Patriarch. American history studies have drifted away from an emphasis on his past great leaders to a more touchy-feely look at modern social issues. Not everywhere, of course, but in a lot of places. And if secular education has drifted away from strong standards, religious education has just been cast loose from its anchor and blown out to sea. Abraham? Who is Abraham? Most so-called Christians would say today. Yet for any serious Bible student, Abraham is one of just a handful of critical characters from the Old Testament. You know, if Jesus had a top three among his apostles, Peter, James, and John, the top three Old Testament heroes would likely be Abraham, Moses, and David. They would have to be. Those are critical, pivotal characters. There are many other important characters, but those three are pivotal men in God's plan of salvation. Well, in our last Bible Basics study, we began looking at the second of key Old Testament passage, the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. We're first introduced to Abraham with basic family background information in chapter 11. And then the record jumps right into the promise that's the foundation for the rest of the Old Testament, and in many respects the New Testament as well. It's such a pivotal event in the plan of God, there was no way to cover it in one lesson, so we broke it into three sections. In part one, we merely introduced it to see the basic outline. And the basic outline is simply this: land, great nation or family, and blessing. What we want to do now is just read the text, and this is from Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Now on the screen, or the monitor behind me, is the English Standard Version. So I'll read that because it was just easier to get onto the screen. Now, beginning in verse 1, Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Abraham is such a pivotal character for the whole Bible because he's more than the father of the physical nation of Israel. According to the New Testament, he is the father of the spiritual nation of Israel, the Church of Christ, because that's where we get into the blessing of all the families of the earth are in and through Jesus Christ. Now we're going to look at that last part next time in much greater detail. But for now, let's explore the elements of the promise and how each was fulfilled. And what we're going to see is that God kept his promise. He kept his land promise, he kept the nation promise, and he kept the blessing promise. All three promises were kept. God can be trusted to keep his word. The land promise was given to Abraham when he didn't own any of it. Interestingly enough, if you look in the text, the promise of giving him the land isn't in this first iteration here in chapter 12, verse 1. Look at verse 1 here in the Genesis chapter 12. Verse 1 says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." So now he's just telling it, he starts off here just with a call to leave. He tells Abraham, you need to leave. Leave this place, go to a place I will show you. Now it's interestingly enough, he sends him to this land, and what's fascinating about it is his situation and circumstances. But he doesn't really tell him he's going to give him anything or give him the land. He gives that other promises, and he will give it later, as we'll see in a moment. But I want you to think about this situation for a moment. Here are Abraham and Sarah living there in Haran, settling into a prosperous city, enjoying all the benefits of a center of civilization. This was an area that would be considered highly civilized, in large part even in today's standards, more so even than a lot of places over there are even today. And in the blink of an eye, all of that changed when God called on him to leave. He told him to pack up and leave his home, his family, his country, and go to a land that God, would show him. I want you to just imagine that conversation between Abraham and Sarah. All right, so Abraham comes home and says, "Sarah, honey, we've got to pack up and leave. Start packing. We're leaving." "Where are we going?" I don't know." "Why are we leaving?" "Well, God told me to." "Where are we going?" "I don't know." "When are we going to get there?" "I don't know." I don't know anything, but God said we have to go. I don't know about you, but that would be an interesting discussion in the McClenny household if I came home and told my wife that. But they went. They left just as God had commanded. We won't turn over there, but mark Hebrews 1. Make a note about Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, because it talks about the faith of Abraham and Sarah, which was an obedient faith that went when sent, did what they were told to do, stopped if told to stop, and constantly complied with God's commands. See, that's the key to faith. This is the faith that always does what God said. Not perfectly, but still obeys God. When God said go, they went. When God said stop, they stopped. This kind of faith, the kind of faith of Abraham, has no similarity at all to the modern concept of faith only, which is a don't go when sent, don't do what you're told, because John Calvin and Martin Luther completely understood what Paul meant when he said we aren't saved by works. The Catholic Church of their day was teaching justification by works, and we're not going to accept their doctrine, and so we're going to go the exact opposite, 180 degrees, the opposite direction, and skip right over what the Bible taught about obedient faith. Paul never pitted obedience against faith. He never said there was a conflict between obeying God and faith. That's what Martin Luther and John Calvin said. Instead, Paul was rejecting a system of works, specifically the law of Moses, and a system of faith. What the Jews of his day, or the Jewish Christians, or the Judaizing teachers of his day were trying to do was they were trying to bring their Jewish religion and attach it to Christianity, or actually, to be more accurate, they were trying to attach Christianity and bring it back within the fold of Judaism. And so they were going around telling all of these Gentile Christians that in order to be saved, you have to become a Jew. Men had to be circumcised, and ultimately what that meant is that all men and women had to follow those Jewish laws. And it would just have absorbed Christianity into Judaism. Paul said absolutely not. Judaism is a system of works. It required perfect obedience. The law of Moses required that you never sin in order for your sins to be taken away. And if you went back to that system from Christ, you cut yourself off from Christ, and you're not trusting in Him. So it's a system of faith. And any system of faith that says here are additional works, not works that are in the Bible, but additional works that are outside of what God taught, Jesus commanded, and what the apostles commanded, and what the New Testament writers commanded. Anything other than that is adding to what God would have them to do, and it's just completely unacceptable. That's what Paul was standing against. The faith system requires obedience. Justification by faith is a condition. To be justified, it is conditioned on you and me having faith. That is a work on our part. Jesus says that faith is a work. Believing in Him is a work, but not a work of perfection that requires sinlessness, because all of us are out. We all lose out in that kind of system. The faith system requires an obedience without making that obedience the means or that which produces the salvation. Jesus Christ is the means of our salvation. His perfect sacrifice, His sinless sacrifice, paid the penalty for our sins because we fail. And because of Him paying that penalty, He is the means of our salvation. He is the power that makes it happen. However, obedient faith is the condition. In order to have access to that blood of Christ to wash our sins away, we must have faith, obedient faith. Faith without obedience is not faith. And then forgiveness of sins is the operation. Once we have faith and we come to Christ in obedient faith and we're baptized into Him, we receive the remission or the forgiveness, the wiping away. Our sins are washed away. They're gone. I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, Abraham would be appalled at the doctrines being taught in his name about how to be justified by faith only. He would be ashamed. It would be ashamed of it. It would be a disgrace, because it is certainly not what he did and how he lived. That's not the kind of faith he had. Now, when Abraham and Sarah arrived at Shechem in the southern part of Israel in Genesis chapter 12, God revealed the gift of the land. This is in chapter 12, verse 7. Notice this. He says here in verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. That's in verse 7. So now he's telling them, I'm going to give you this land. He told them, come to a land that come to the land that I'll show you. Now that they're there, he's saying, I'm going to give this land to you. So this is really the first actual indication or revelation that he told Abraham he was going to give him this land. He might have earlier, but here's the first time it's actually put in writing for us to know about. So having come that far, what Abraham did is he responded in faith by building an altar. Verse 7, he says, so he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So what does Abraham do when God speaks to him and says, I'm going to do this? He worships. There's that obedience still. Every time God speaks, Abraham obeys. That's what faith does. And that's why what is taught as faith today is just so egregiously insulting to the faith of Abraham. Now, this promise was revealed in a couple of other places. In Genesis chapter 13 and verses 14 through 18, he gives that in more detail. Verse 14, in Genesis 13, he says, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. And so there he's giving him some more detail about it. He has said this land in Shechem, and now he's saying, there he's in Bethel, he says, look out, and he's saying, I'm going to give all of this to you. All right, so he's expanding, or not expanding it, but expanding Abraham's vision of what God is going to give him. And then in chapter 15, in verses 18 through 21, we'll look at verse 18. On that day, the Lord, this is Genesis 15, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. And so God now sets the boundaries for the land that he's going to give to Abraham. He's telling him, this is the land you're going to have. Here's how far it will go, to the north and to the south. To the Mediterranean Sea on the west, and to the Jordan actually on the east, but ends up, when they come up, they actually get east of the Jordan. They get territory on the east side of the Jordan as well because of the nations there that attacked them instead of just leaving them alone. So they got this land. This is the land that was promised to the nation of Israel. They actually got more than they were promised. Now there's a common doctrine out there today that says that Israel didn't get the promise. The land promise was never fulfilled, and that somehow or another God's going to restore Israel, and that's happened in 1948 according to some. And so now as soon as Israel regains all of that territory, then God will reestablish his kingdom on earth, and Jesus will come and rule in Jerusalem over an earthly kingdom on an earthly throne in this earthly city of Jerusalem. Ladies and gentlemen, that's just not true. If you believe that, I'm sorry, that's simply not true. Because we have some passages where God himself, through his authorized spokesman, his chosen leader, Joshua, confirmed that God had fulfilled that promise. Look, if you will, in Joshua. One passage in Joshua chapter 21 says this, so the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers. All of it, not a part of it, not some of it, all of it. And they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest on every side according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and no one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a preacher or teacher that tells you that God didn't fulfill the promise to Abraham and that they've got to fulfill the land promise sometime in the future, take them to this passage, go to that passage, ask them why they would say something that's so clearly contradictory to what God has said to us. This is what God revealed. I didn't make this up. I didn't come up with some theory and say, just ignore what this says, because you can't ignore what the Bible says. It says it. We need to be believing it and accepting it for what it is. Well, there's another passage. Joshua kept going. In chapter 23, in verse 14, he says, now behold, he's dead. They've conquered the land. They've had all these wars. The successful war, they divided the land up among all the tribes. And Joshua stated emphatically that the promise had been fulfilled toward the end of his life. Now, behold, today I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. Now, who are you going to believe? Your premillennial teacher who says, no, they all failed and God's got to come back and restore the kingdom and fulfill this land promise? Or what Joshua said? And Joshua is speaking for God. And there's other passages in Chronicles that talk, and 2 Kings, 1 Kings, and in Chronicles, where you read about how this promise was fulfilled, and David and Solomon had control of this same territory. And so the kingdom was established. Now, this promise actually was conditional, but we'll get into that next week. Who should we believe? God or modern-day premillennial teachers? Tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go with God on this one. I don't know about you, but my preference is that when I have a denominational preacher saying, or any preacher saying this, and the Bible saying that, I'm going to go with what the Bible says. I'm going to go with what God says. And I hope you will too. Well, let's go to the second part of the promise, and that's the great nation or the family. It's in verse 2, Genesis 12, verse 2. Now the Lord said to Abram, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And so he's going to have a very large family. Out of Abraham is going to spring this gigantic nation of people. And that's an odd promise, considering that at the time God made this promise, Abraham was 75, Sarah was 65, and they were childless. They had no children. Zip, zero, nada kiddos. And this promise, though, was repeated a number of times after this, until God made it clear, and let me back up, until God made it clear that it was going to be Abraham and Sarah's child between the two of them. They tried different things. They tried to get God to accept one of his servants as his heir. And God said, nope, not going to be a servant. It's going to be your child, Abraham. So Sarah said, oh, well, he said, your son, Abraham. So Abraham, you go in with my handmaid Hagar. You have a child with her, and that'll be the son of promise. And later on, God came and spoke to Abraham, and Abraham said, Ishmael is going to be the son of promise. God, no, God said, it's not going to be Ishmael. It's not going to be your servant. It's going to be a son that you and Sarah are going to have. And at the time God told them that, he said, a year from now, I'm going to come by, and you and Sarah will have a boy. And Abraham was 99, and Sarah was 89 when God told them that. And they trusted God, and sure enough, they had a baby. Physically impossible, but by the power of God and their faith in God's power, it happened. They got together, and they had a child. Well after either one of them should have been able to produce one. Well, now the promise was fulfilled. Sort of. Because it's just one son. I mean, he had the son Ishmael, but Ishmael's not part of that promise. He had one son. And Isaac had no children until he was 60. And then his youngest boy, Jacob, finally had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel, who grew into a huge multitude while they were down in Egypt. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7 tells us there were 70 family members when they went into the land, or went down into Egypt, because they went down there because of a drought, and Joseph was down there and so forth. I won't go into that story. You study that independently, or we'll get to that some other time. They had these 12 sons. I want you to notice what Exodus 1:7 says. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty. so that the land was filled with them. And so they turned into, there in Egypt, this great nation, this gigantic family that God had promised. Despite Pharaoh's efforts to destroy them, to reduce them, he enslaved them, he tried to kill their sons, he wanted to keep them from growing, but God kept them growing until he finally sent Moses down to bring them out of Egypt. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7, God called them sons of Israel. The Lord said, I called them his people. He said, surely I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering. So God is calling them his people. Now these people, this children of Israel, these descendants of Israel or Jacob, have become the great nation. They are his people. They are God's people. That's what he calls them. Then when they came out, they got to Mount Sinai to make the covenant with God, the Old Testament, the Old Law. God established his covenant with them, and he called them the house of Jacob, sons of Israel. This is in Exodus chapter 19, verse 3. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell of the sons of Israel, if you will indeed, so he calls them house of Jacob and the sons of Israel. Then he goes on to say, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. If you're paying attention on my An American Missionary page, Facebook page, and my YouTube channel, whichever one you watch this on, I have a series on 1 Peter. Look for the playlist 1 Peter. And I'm talking about where Peter takes this very text and applies it to the church. That's next week's lesson. But I want you to know that this is all transferred eventually to apply to the church of Christ, the people of God, the Lord's church, his people, wherever they are. Not just in Jerusalem, and certainly not just Jews. Promise number 2 has been fulfilled. So the land promise was fulfilled. Now we've got the nation family promise has been fulfilled. And so let's go to the third section, the third part of the promise, the blessing promise. This is from verse 3, Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. There God told Abraham that in him, that is in Abraham, God would bless all the nations of the earth. Now obviously, that was not personally or specifically in Abraham, because he lived an obscure life as a stranger in a strange land, a pilgrim in a land that was not his, a stranger in a strange land that was not his, a pilgrim among a people to whom he was not related. So it wasn't him. Most of the people of that day, I think we would be surprised, those of you who study the Bible would be surprised at how few people really knew anything about Abraham. He was nobody in his day, except within certain circumstances and certain places. Go to Genesis 22 to see how this is fulfilled. In Genesis chapter 22, after Isaac is now a young lad, God has Abraham offer him as a sacrifice and stops him because he's teaching Abraham a lesson and also us a lesson that we'll get into next week. In Genesis 22 verse 17 and 18, God specifies that it's going to be through the seed of Abraham. He says, indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their or his enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now this is the New American Standard Version. I use the English Standard Version at the very beginning for the quotes from Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Long reason for that. Won't go into that. But here, this is New American Standard. And unfortunately, the New American Standard still uses the word seed. A better word is multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens and the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendant shall possess the gate of their enemies, or actually his enemies. And in your descendant, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now, why did I switch from descendants to descendant? Because there's a progression here in the text. Notice that obviously at the start it says your seed as the stars of the heavens. So your descendants. So he's going to have this multitude of nation. And so that nation that came out of Egyptian captivity was this huge nation of people. All right, this large nation of people, the people of God, the descendants or the family of Israel. But what happens here in the text is he switches where it says, which is on the seashore, and then it switches to, that's plural. Now all of a sudden he switches to singular, seed. Now the word seed actually it's one of those words like her and like sheep. Sheep, is it one sheep or two or more? Well, it's a word that can be either plural or singular. Seed is a word that can be, do you have any seed? That can be one or many. Well, descendant, descendants is plural, descendant is singular, but the word in Hebrew is singular or plural depending on the circumstance. What happens here is beginning at the word and, your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. It switches to completely to a singular process. Singular concept is no longer plural, but singular. All of the tenses of the words that form that clause are singular. Now, maybe you're looking at me and saying, well, what difference does it make? Well, it makes a lot of difference. But why did the translators do that? Well, they were looking at it from their perspective. They ignored the fact that this was singular and looked back to the plural part and made it, and so they basically just kind of gave their interpretation. They thought, well, this is the best way to interpret that, even though it was all singular. They looked back at the preceding the portion instead of that part and the first part of verse 18, which is also in the singular. And the biggest mistake they made in translators who use the plural here is ignoring the definitive proof of the New Testament where Paul revealed that the seed or descendant spoken of at the end of verse 17 and beginning of verse 18 is none other than Jesus Christ. That's what they should have looked at. Look in Galatians 3:16. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. Say offspring instead of seed. It does not say and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. See, any doubt about how and through whom the blessings of all nations, the blessing of all nations would come, was removed for those willing to see Jesus as the promised one who would bring the blessings. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is our next lesson. Let's wrap up. The land promise was fulfilled, so no future fulfillment is to be expected or needed. The nation promise was fulfilled, so again, no future fulfillment is to be expected. The blessing came 2,000 years ago when Jesus brought salvation to the world through his death on the cross. And that message of salvation has been preached to all nations, and all nations, people from all nations have come to Jesus. Like me, like you. I'm an American missionary. I'm not a Jewish missionary because I'm not Jewish, but I'm a Christian. And I'm an heir of the promise made to Abraham through Jesus Christ. And so are you if you are in Jesus Christ. As long as this earth stands, we will keep preaching the blessing of God as being available for all. It's available for anybody and everybody. Here in America, all over the world, it doesn't matter where you are. All four corners of the globe, the gospel message is available. The blessing is available for those who will hear and obey by faith. And that's the mission of me as an American missionary. To proclaim salvation, salvation, salvation in Jesus. Not in some allegedly required restoration of a physical nation of Israel or a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, but here in America and all over the world as souls hear the gospel and come to Jesus in obedient faith. And that means the promises have been kept, the blessing of salvation in Jesus came, and it's available for you today. And that really leaves the final question that we'll leave you with. Will you accept it by obedient faith? The blessing's available, but you must have the same kind of faith that Abraham. The faith that when God says go, you go. That when God says do, you do. Instead of the faith that is taught out there in the world that says, when God said do, you don't have to. You can ignore what God said. No, that's not faith. That is a rebellious attitude and rejection of the will of God. Don't fall for that, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you're not a Christian, why not become one? It would be my pleasure to assist you or to put you in touch with those who can assist you if you live too far from Bowling Green, Kentucky. Now, how can I do that? Well, reach out to me by Facebook Messenger or by email. You can reach me at anamericanmissionarybg@gmail.com. Yes, I know it's a long one. Pause the video, write it down, send me an email, or just click. You can send me a message through Facebook. You can send me a message through YouTube as well. Here, right on An American Missionary. I'll be happy to study with you, help you understand what you need to do to be with Christ. Now, if you just want to fight with me, sorry, I'm not interested in getting into fights with people. You want to fight, go find somebody else that likes to fight. I just want to teach the truth to people that are willing to hear it and listen to it. And I ask you, please, please, please be sure to watch the Promised Seed of Abraham Part 3 next time for more detail about how it's all about Jesus. See, that's what this is. This is the 5 key passages of the Old Testament are all about Jesus. This is kind of pursuing the idea of who is the real Jesus and seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. Come back for that, will you? I hope you will. Until then, I'm James McClenny, and I'm praying that your heart will be filled with the glory of God.